Thank you. Thanks for reminding me about that. Yeah, aggregate demand and aggregate supply. In this chapter, we'll be talking about a really important tool to study aggregate demand and aggregate output, which is the IS curve. First of all, there is this concept, which is the planned expenditure. The idea is that as a person, as an individual, I look at the situation around me and I then decide, is this the right time to buy a new car? Is this the time for me to buy that like new laptop I always wanted to buy, or the new car I wanted, or that take that vacation I always wanted to take? Is this the right moment? This is called planned expenditure. It's the total amount of spending on domestically produced goods and services that households, businesses, the government, and foreigners want to make. So, as a man or a businesswoman, I own my own business. I want to understand how many customers I will get. For example, will I be having 10 customers today? If I own a restaurant, will I have 10 customers today or 100 customers? Now imagine every single business put together. This is a macro course. We're not talking about micro. We're not talking about one business. We're talking about every business put together in a country. The whole country will face a planned demand, something that we expect to happen. This is the planned expenditure. It's not the same as the actual expenditure. You may plan, but then the actual may change, which is the amount actually spent on. Now, Keynesian thinking views aggregate demand as planned expenditure. The entire demand for every single type of good or a service in the country, in the economy, in the domestic economy, is aggregate demand put together. And that is the same as planned expenditure. Now, remember this was the GDP formula. We defined a country's GDP as this. This GDP, if you remember, we talked about two ways to calculate GDP. One was from expenditures and the other one was from output or sales. And we said that if you ever take an accounting course, you can see that the two will be equal to each other. This is when we come back to that. Total planned expenditure or aggregate demand will be equal to the GDP. Consumption expenditure, planned investment, government purchases, and net exports. All the components of the GDP. So the economy will produce equally to what we expect people to buy. If I expect to have 10 people, 10 customers, if I'm a restaurant owner and I'm expecting 10 customers today, I will buy enough raw materials, enough like beef and pork and chicken and rice and all the stuff that you need for cooking to feed 10 customers. If I'm expecting 100 customers, I will produce for 100 meals to be able to serve my customers. So the two will be equal. Consumption expenditure, planned investment spending, government purchases, and net exports. Now, Keynes viewed that consumer expenditure is related to disposable income. The whole idea of Keynes was that he kept saying this during the 1930 Great Depression, before everybody listened to him, that you see, the reason there is so much unemployment and the situation keeps getting worse and worse is because people don't have disposable income. When people don't have disposable income, they're not going to buy anything. All the supply curves and demand curves that we see, you see those demand curves going down, they all assume that you have the money to buy something. A demand curve, for example, let me show you this. Let's say this is the market for shoes. You have a demand curve and a supply curve. Now we say every point on this demand curve represents how much value you assign to something. So if you value something at this point, you're prepared to pay this much money. This would be your price. And this would be the equilibrium price, which is the last person who values the good as this much will buy it. But this market is based on this assumption that we have the money to pay for it. What if I valued something super high? Let's say food. People who starve in countries that are suffering from famine, they value food really high. I mean, if you're starving, you value it very high. But you still starve. Why? Because you don't have the money to buy it. You must have the budget, the disposable income to buy this. And this is what Keynes said, that your market, the whole idea, this is the basic of every single classical economic thinking. This. And this is not realistic because this only works when the person on the demand side, who is on the demand side, has the money to pay for this. If the person doesn't have the budget, it doesn't matter how much he or she values the good. He or she won't be able to buy it. So Keynes viewed that consumer expenditure is related to disposable income, which is the total income minus net taxes. This is not taxes, this is net taxes. So for example, if you're living in the United States, your tax rates are low, yep. You will pay a low tax rate. So your Y would be minus a very low T. But if you're living, for example, in Sweden or Germany, your tax rate will be very high. The government will take like everything you're making. But then it's not gone. Most of it will come back through free healthcare, free education, free this, free that, all of those. So it is not just taxes, it is net taxes. Some of the money that leaves your pocket may end up coming back into your pocket. And that will influence your disposable income. If I no longer have to worry about my healthcare, I will have more disposable income to pay for something that I wanted. On the other hand, if my healthcare is privately funded, then I have to plan for example, my visit to the dentist. I wouldn't be able to go on vacation if I'm planning to go to the dentist. So yeah, that. Now, can you turn on your cameras? That would be great if you can do that. It really helps me because if no one turns on his camera, I feel like I'm talking to myself. Yep, thank you, Matthew. I really owe you, man. You saved my life this course. Yeah, you should try to like put yourselves in my shoes and like sometimes when I keep talking, and I just see myself, It's not good. I can't focus. So let's continue. Now, the consumption function. Every part, every different component of that aggregate demand, let's cover them. The consumption first. Remember at the beginning of the semester, we talked about consumption would be equal to some exogenous, some autonomous consumption plus everything else. This autonomous consumption, this is just like a normal level of consumption that doesn't change with respect to macroeconomic variables. These are the basic necessities, the things that people take for granted. They need to have those. But then the second part are those goods and services that you're like, before you buy them and pay for them, you always ask yourself, is this the right time to do this? It will be marginal propensity of to consume, multiply your disposable income, your total income output. This you I'm talking about is now the entire country, the entire nation. So when I'm saying your income, your output, I mean the output of the entire country put together. Minus net taxes. This marginal propensity to consume it shows how responsive you are to changes in like your disposable income. The change in consumption expenditure as a result of one additional dollar of Y, or disposable income. So how, if I want to explain this, consider this. Some people are very careful about spending money. These people, they always plan ahead. If they have a lot of disposable income, then they will give themselves a break. Some others, they just spend money. If I make like $100, I will immediately spend that $100. I would like probably spend just $99. That depends on the person, on the character. And this is about the character of a nation. So your responsiveness to your disposable income. How much of that disposable income are you going to spend? Now, consumption would be autonomous plus how much you're taking from your disposable income minus your responsiveness to real interest rate. Why? Because you're always facing this decision. Should I consume my money, spend my money, or should I what? What's the alternative to consumption?
Saving.
Yes. Should I spend my money or should I save my money? That's the question that you always ask yourselves. So one part of what drives you towards making that decision is your disposable income. The other one, the disposable income part, will incentivize you to save. The second one is how much you're expecting to gain if you save money. That would disincentivize you from consumption and incentivizes you to save. So one of them is a positive effect, marginal propensity to consume, multiplied by Y minus net taxes. This would improve your consumption. Now I have money, I don't need to worry about it. I deserve a break. So let me just take that fancy vacation I always want to take. The other side negatively influences your consumption. This is a lowercase c multiplied by real interest rate. This is how responsive you are to real interest rate. Now, if interest rates are really high, I think with myself, well, if I save my money now, I can get a lot of returns. Now, if I don't take that vacation, if I am smart, if I'm be a smart, I'm thinking to myself now, if I'm smart and instead of taking that vacation, I would save my money, then after 5 years, I can probably buy a house and I would no longer have to pay rent. So this is not the moment for that vacation. This is the moment to save my money. This C is depending again on the character, how much responsive you are to that real interest rate. Responsiveness of consumption with regard to real interest rate. So this marginal propensity of to consume improves your incentivizes you to consume. Your responsiveness to real interest rate disincentivizes you. It would like, hold on, don't consume all your money now. Save some of it. Look at how high the interest rates are. If you save your money now, you're going to have a lot of returns later. Two types of investments. Fixed investments is planned spending by firms on equipment, structures. You buy yourself a tractor, you're a farmer, you buy yourself a brand new tractor, that's investment. Also, the second one is inventory investment. Remember this, the restaurant owner or the farmer? The farmer has some crops, lots of crops. Like let's assume corn. Let's assume I'm a corn farmer. Now I have like 10 tons of corn. I would not eat them, but sell them, 9 tons of corn. It would be extremely difficult for me to eat 9 tons of corn. Not impossible though. So I would consume 9 tons of my harvest, but then 1 ton I would put back in the ground. It would be inventory investment. This is what I saved in my inventory, spending by firms on additional holdings of raw materials. Raw materials you need to produce. You put them in a warehouse, in an inventory, you save them. That's also investment because you're expecting a return on this. And it's a thing. You're not gambling on, like, if I deposit grain, for example, in a silo, I'm not gambling of whether my grain will be grain or whether it will turn to dust. It's not the same as like speculating on markets and stuff. It's actually there, so it's an investment, and it's an inventory investment. Raw materials, parts very important for maintenance. Maintenance is a huge thing in investment when you consider depreciation. Remember from the Solo model, you had this depreciation rate. Every year, some of your investments are depreciated. So you need parts to replace them. And finished goods, of course, that you can sell later. Like, for example, if a car manufacturer produces a car and people don't buy it this year, the car manufacturer won't just throw the car into the ocean. It would save it, put it in some warehouse, and sell it next year. That's also inventory investment. Planned investment spending equals planned fixed investment plus the amount of inventory investment planned by firms. So planned investment spending equals whatever you are planning to spend on fixed investment plus the amount of investment planned. Fixed investment plus the amount of inventory investment planned. Just like consumption, your investment is also depending on real interest rate. The animal spirit. This is beautiful. Planned investment is negatively related to the real interest rate. And it's also affected by business expectations about the future. As John Keynes called it, the animal spirits. There is like a bull and there is a bear. So if you've ever heard the terms like a bear market or a bull market, this is just funny. Animal spirits. So if I'm expecting the situation to be very nice, I would invest to be able to produce next period so that I can meet that extra demand. I would be equal to your investment would be equal to your autonomous investment, also the animal spirit minus some responsiveness multiplied by real interest rate. If real interest rates are low, your situation would be different than when real interest rates are high. Your responsiveness of investment to real interest rate. Now, and of course, we have the net exports, which is again autonomous net exports. These are the levels of net exports that need to happen. For example, for United States, the country's Sunbelt states, they're like the most productive agricultural place in the world. No matter how much they produce and how many people live in the United States, it will still be a lot more than demand. So a lot of these like corn and soybean needs to be exported. Or an oil exporting country, for example, Iran. No matter how much the domestic economy demands gas and like oil, there will still be a lot left. So that would be exported nonetheless. This is the autonomous net exports. But then there is a second part to it. The second part is also related to the real interest rate. How a component negatively related to the real interest rate. A higher interest rate raises the demand for dollars. When interest rates are high, you want to keep your dollars. You want to save them. So your demand for dollars would go up. And so its exchange rate compared to the other country, for example, United States and China, compared to yuan, the Chinese currency, your price, your exchange rate would go up, the price of currency, which in turn lowers net exports. How? When your domestic currency is more expensive compared to the domestic currency of the other country, whatever you're producing now will end up being more expensive. So you will lose competitiveness. How? Let's say I've always paid my workers $100, and a Chinese businessman in China has always been paying his workers 100 yuan. Now, because of the higher interest rates inside the United States, there is a higher demand for dollars. So my $100, it's now more valuable than before. So what happens is that my real costs, my nominal costs are still the 100, but my real costs, the actual value that I have to spend on my business would go up. And therefore, my real price would go up. Or if I keep the price constant, my real profits would go down. All the while, all the time, the Chinese competition is still paying the 100 yuan that he paid before. So his costs would remain constant. I will lose competitiveness. He will defeat me in the global market. This is why, for example, many have been accusing China of artificially lowering its currency. It's called currency manipulation. They've been saying that the Chinese government is devaluating its currency. Why? To make its goods more productive. And that's a huge argument. There are many arguments for this, and there are also many arguments against it. There was actually, for my own research, I studied really important work, which is I constantly use in my class as well, as an example, that this is like a golden article for me, that this devaluation of currency, even if it exists, it won't help China. Why? Because it doesn't matter how much the Chinese are devaluating their currency. Most of the value of the exports will eventually leave the country because of the global supply chain. For example, Apple. Apple produces its phones in China, while China gets to only keep 25% of that value that was sold for. So the price of an Apple phone, an iPhone, let's say it's $100. China will own, the Chinese economy will only keep $25 in the country. $75 will end up leaving. Most of it will actually end up in the United States itself. Like some of it will go to Korea, some of it to Japan, because, for example, Koreans have built the LCD, the LED monitor display. The Japanese have made, I don't know, the battery, and the Chinese have made the CPU of the phone, and all. It's a global network. So that paper actually said. But then what you need to know is that the basic understanding is that when a business is purely domestic, raising currency prices will hurt its competitiveness. Suddenly your goods won't be as competitive as before on the global market. So your net exports would end up falling. Exchange rate goes up, demand for dollars would go up, therefore your net exports will go down. Definitely you'll see something about this on your exam. Very important topic. Now, well, everyone's favorite topic, everyone's favorite part of the economy, the government, it's an exogenous. We assume it is an exogenous term, that the government's expenditure is fixed and the government will actually not spend like 10 times what used to be a spend last year, this year. We're going to assume that. Taxes, we also assume that are going to be exogenous as well and fixed. Equilibrium in the economy, it will be the moment when your total output is equal to your planned expenditure. That would be the equilibrium. The equilibrium condition, therefore, is that your output equals your expenditure. Your output equals your planned expenditure, this part. The left side is your output, the right side is your planned expenditure. Now there are some math here. You just need to substitute these equations that we covered here. Because we want to get rid of everything on the constants and stuff and just focus on real interest rates. What we want to know as macroeconomists, how much the output of the economy change if we play with the real interest rate. This is the Keynesian thinking. play with the real interest rate, and you can see the economy actually works. Output would change. The IS curve shows the relationship between aggregate output and the real interest rate when the goods market is in equilibrium. The IS curve is made of two terms. The first term tells us about shifts in the IS curve. This part here. Now, remember, marginal propensity to income, it's how responsive you are and what fraction of your income you're going to spend. It can never be more than one. So if it's your marginal propensity to consumption of what? Of your disposable income. It can never be more than one. Why? Because I can never spend $2 if I only have $1 in my pocket. It will always be lower than one, not even equal to one. It will always be like even at least an epsilon lower than one. So what you'll end up with is this. Denominator will always be bigger than the denominator, and the denominator will also always be a positive number. So one over one minus marginal propensity to consume. One is obviously a positive number. Since this is lower than one, this will also be a positive number. Positive divided by positive will be positive number. And it's also almost always lower than one, because one will be divided by something less than one. And the second part, what was the second part? The second terms, it tells us a move along the IS curve. A change in the real interest rate affects output. This part, it's about the first part is about the autonomous variables. The second part is about the real interest rate. What the IS curve tells us, it always is a downward sloping because of this part. This will be positive, 1 minus MPC, remember, a positive number. Denominator will also be positive. Three numbers are added, summed together. So positive over positive will be a positive, and there is a negative sign. Therefore, the slope of this function, which is a function of R, your real interest rate changing, the slope will be negative. When the slope of a function is negative, the function will be going down. It's downwards. It's downward sloping, because as the real interest rate rises, planned expenditure and aggregate output would fall due to lower consumption expenditure, planned investment, spending, and net exports. All those other things would go down. They are negatively affected by interest rate, real interest rate. Now, question. Actually, not a question. This is why governments all over the world are trying to constantly lower their interest rates. You see, because of this Keynesian fact here, everywhere in the world, politicians are usually always at least trying to ask nicely from the heads of their central bank to lower the interest rates, because higher interest rate would discourage people from spending, would incentivize them to save so that they won't consume. Also, interest rate is the price you pay to borrow money. So if interest rate goes up, you are discouraged to buy money from the bank or get a loan. So your investments would go down. Also, if your interest rate goes up, your currency will be more in demand, it will be more valuable, and you won't be as competitive. Therefore, your exports would go down. So if at least if you're a politician, you would look at interest rates like, oh my God, this thing doesn't have any benefits. Now, quickly, this is the question. What's the benefit of the real interest rate then? I mean, this thing is pretty awful. It has no benefit. See, real interest rate rises, planned expenditure, aggregate output, lower consumption, planned investment, spending, and net exports. Everything will be affected negatively. So why do we have like interest rates? Why shouldn't the government just bring it down to zero? Anyone?
Would there not be an incentive to lend then?
It will always be and it would not be an incentive to save. Yes, but then again, what happens is that people will be incentivized to ask for investments. I mean, how do I explain this? Like it will cancel itself on the loanable funds market.
Okay, yeah, I was just wondering if like there wouldn't be enough lenders to go around because everybody would want to borrow if interest rates were really low. But
yeah, but it will fix it itself, because when everyone wants to borrow, then demand would go up and you will ask for more price.
Okay.
Yeah, supply and demand, they would adjust themselves. But then why doesn't the government lowers interest rates to zero? Remember from before we talked about money supply, inflation. This is the problem. If you lower your interest rates to zero, you will cause inflation. And inflation, remember the costs of inflation? Inflation is not a good thing. All the menu costs, shoe leather costs, and all of that, and the existing variability of the whole planning could cause the country to go really strangely. Therefore, inflation is also not good. And this is the beauty of economics. You never have a good or a bad situation. You always are dealing with trade-offs. You see, this slide is just, you look at this and you'll be like, oh my God, there is nothing worse than real interest rate in the world. We should just destroy it. We should just remove it. We should just go back to the medieval times and have like a non-usury or usury, what's it called in English? Loan system. But then you go back a few chapters to when we talked about costs of inflation, you'll be like, oh my God, real interest rate is the best thing in the world. And this is the beauty of economics. You're constantly facing trade-offs. This is why there is so much pressure on the head of a central bank. What do I do? This politician is constantly asking me to lower interest rates. But what if there is a recession after that? I lowered my interest rates, I caused inflation, and now there's like a recession, the business cycles. What do I do now? it will be a disaster. Or what if I can actually lower interest rates and the economy's output would go up, people will go to work, and people's life will be improved? What do I do? This constant trade-off. There is no right or wrong answer. It's just a constant trade-off. At least to me, it's beautiful, these trade-offs. So let's look at the example. Let's look at this economy, your autonomous consumption, your investments, your government expenditure, and all of that. After you solve, you'll end up with the function. This is a very simple example, very simple. Numbers are really simple. On your exam, you will probably get something like this, depending on my mood. I may feel like adventurous and I will give you something like that question 3 on the first midterm, or I may just give you something very similar to this. But then you will end up with a function like this. It has an intercept 12, which is showing you the the intercept of this function, which is your autonomous variables, which is driven from the autonomous consumption, the autonomous investment, and all of that, and the autonomous net exports and government expenditure. The second part, the negative, is -1. It's the slope of the function, which shows you how responsive your output is to real interest rate. If you increase your real interest rate by 1, how much will your output change? How much? In this function, 12 minus r, if I increase my interest rate to 1 by 1, how much will my output change?
$11.
Now, how much will it change? It will be 11, yes, but how much did it change from 12?
1.
1. 1 unit went down. This is important. It went down. This is the whole basic of Keynesian thinking, that if you increase interest rates, output would go down. Now, what you need to do is that when there is a crisis, lower the interest rates so that output can go up because of all those components that we talked about. Your consumption will be improved, your investment will be improved, and everything. To that, Friedrich Hayek and Austrians are saying, they have a very beautiful response, that nothing in real will change. You're just giving a short-term change. It's like drinking alcohol. You'll drink alcohol, you'll be drunk, you'll be intoxicated, you'll feel good, you'll be happy, but then next morning, you wake up with a headache. If you're 30 plus years old, especially. If you're like in 20 years old, it's a different situation. But you'll wake up with a headache and you're like, that's your hangover. This is the situation with the interest rates. If you play with the interest rates, in the long run, nothing will change. You're just moving prosperity of next year to prosperity to this year. Next year, you'll have the problem again. To that, Keynesian's answer, well, in the long run, we'll all be, what will be in the long run?
Dead.
Dead. In the long run, we'll all be dead. You don't need to worry about the long run. That's what they said in 1930s. And now, well, in 2020, you have the right to say, well, guys, you may be dead, but we're not. So thank you very much for this. That's also the response of Austrians. Actually, they said that now in 2008, now this is the long run. This is the result of all the mistakes that you made in the economy. Now you're making another mistake. In 2008, when it was time for bailouts, Austrians were saying that don't bail these guys out. They made a mistake. Let them go out of business. Don't take loss out of the economy. Economy is about profit and loss. If I'm every time I lose, I call my government and say, "Hello, President. I just lost like $10 billion today. Would you be kind enough to write me a check?" And the government would like anything for you, my friend, because I love you. Here, $10 billion, or in case of bailouts, like trillions. What makes me to be more careful? There will be no end to the costs of this behavior. This is what like the Austrians were saying, is that now we're in the long term. Instead of learning from the mistakes you made with the New Deal, don't repeat the mistakes. But then they repeated it. And then in 2020, when COVID arrived, they repeated it again. And I'm pretty sure next time they will repeat it again. But in reality, you see, nothing is changing. What happens is that by applying a short-term answer, by playing with interest rates, the long-term growth perspective of the country is being hurt. All that money that the government paid for bailouts ended up being budget deficit, ended up as a budget deficit. A budget deficit means that the government now has to pay a lot of money just as interests because of all the loans it took. All that money will mean higher taxes. All that higher taxes will mean less disposable income. So we're back at the beginning. We're back here. Less consumption. Now I have to pay taxes to fund a mistake, according to Keynesian, according to Austrians, to fund a mistake. Therefore, playing with the interest rate will not change anything. To that, again, the Keynesian would answer, well, at least you have a job to pay taxes. If we didn't save you during the Great Depression, you wouldn't have a job. In 2008, if we didn't bail out those banks, there wouldn't be a world economy today for you to worry about. And again, this argument never ends. It's a beautiful thing in the economics, in macroeconomics, and it will never end. At the center of it are these formulas that you're learning today. So, who will be? Yep, here. What happens if the economy is located at the right side of the curve, of the IS curve? Now, let's talk about this curve. This would be your curve, 12 minus R. That would be your function. This is called the IS curve. Now, you could be on the left side of the IS curve or on the right side. You may happen on each one of these sides. So let's assume we're at the right side. Currently, the government is at the right side. The economy is at the right side of the IS curve. What would happen? When you're on the right side, this means that your actual output, the x-axis, it's bigger than what's demanded by the economy. So when you're on the right side, you will cut back on production. People won't buy that many goods. Your output would go down if you keep the interest rate constant. Your output would go down. What happens is if the economy is located at the left side, our actual output, if you're on the left side of the IS curve, it means actual output is below planned expenditure, so that firms with declining inventory will raise their production. When you're on the left side, it will be the opposite. When you're on the left side, it means that you're expecting a lot more customers because of all those reasons we talked about. Yep, here. When you're on the left side, this means that your interest rates are lower than, for example, if you're here, your output is at 7, your interest rates should be 5. But what if your interest rates are 3%? If the interest rate is 3%, this means that your output should be 9, not 7. Because of all the problems associated with interest rates that we talked about, effect on consumption, investment, blah, blah, blah. What happens is that at 3%, you'll have a lot more customers. So you'll need to prepare 9 meals. If you're a restaurant owner, instead of 7 meals, you need to prepare 9 meals. If you're a country, instead of producing an aggregate output of $7 trillion, you need to move back on the IS curve and produce $9 trillion. Now you can understand why politicians love low interest rates. If you increase output, how do you increase output again? You have to hire people. So unemployment would go down. Unemployment goes down, more people will have more disposable income. So it will create a very nice domino effect. Every good thing will lead to another. And it's usually end up at an election. So these dominoes, they are like, they try to, at least they hope that these dominoes would help hit each other right before the election so that they can be re-elected. That's like one way to do this. Yeah. And of course, they won't be around to face the inflation effects after their term is up. But if you're on the right side, if your interest rate is at 3% and you're producing $12 trillion, your interest rates are too high for this output. This means you won't have that many customers. So you need to cut back your output to 9 to be able to satisfy your limited number of customers. Any questions? Am I making sense? These are serious stuff like you're being exposed to for the first time. Is there any questions? Is there anybody still here?
We're here.
Yeah.
Okay.
So all good? Remember, if you don't want to ask questions now, you can always send me an email. You can ask for office hours. I would be glad. So don't be intimidated by this stuff. If this is your first time seeing this, don't be intimidated. Let's move on. Yeah. Why the IS curve has its name and its relationship with the saving investment diagram. The goods market equilibrium of the IS curve is equivalent to the equilibrium at which the desired investment I equals desired savings. So the goods market, which is the output versus real interest rate, it's just another definition of the saving investment market. Remember, demand for investment, supply of savings. Assume let's just assume that you got rid of all the government and net exports. It's a closed economy with no government. Basically my dream. So your economy is just very simple. Just your output will be your consumption plus your investment. Now, if you subtract C from both sides, therefore, whatever you have produced, if you didn't consume it, Y minus C, so you produce something, you consumed some of it, whatever is left will be your investments, which is equal at the equilibrium, it will be equal to your savings. See, this is the saving investment. Let's say a rise in real interest rates. Excuse me, a drop in real interest rate would then cause a rise in output, which then cause increased savings, which then causes the interest rate to fall to a new equilibrium. What happened here first? Oh yeah, let's just analyze it from the output perspective. Step one, output increases, therefore your savings will increase. Remember, your output goes up, your consumption will go up by a fraction of that increase in output. That your MPC, marginal propensity to consumption, here. Let me draw it. If your Y goes up, this is Y. This part would go up. And this part is lower than Y. Let's get rid of this and also the CR part. This is lower than R. Therefore, your C will go down, will go up. Yes, but less than, let's call this delta C, less than how much your Y went up. Assume taxes are also zero. If your Y, if your output goes up by 10 and your MPC is, let's say, 0.5, your C will go up by how much?
5.
5. And 5 is less than 10. What would happen to the other 5 if you don't consume some of it, some stuff? What do you do to that?
Would it become savings?
Exactly, yes. So when output rises, you'll have increased savings. Increased savings would shift your supply curve in the saving investment market. This is your savings. Now you have more output. Now you're richer. Now you can hopefully save some money after you paid rent and everything. So your savings would go up. Which went down, sorry. This is what happens when everybody turns off their camera. So bad of me. This is investment. We demand investment. I'm telling it to myself. I made a mistake. We demand investment and we supply savings. When output goes up, your savings will increase. Therefore, your saving curve would shift to the right. Therefore, your interest rate would go up or down. If there is a shift, the rightward shift for your savings curve, what would happen to your interest rate?
Would it go down?
Go down, yes. So now you're here at a new equilibrium with a lower interest rate because of a rise in output. The IS curve, on the other hand, it looks at this from the opposite way. These two happen simultaneously. A saving investment market curve will look at this from the point of first there is an increased output, then there is a fall in real interest rate. The IS curve will look at it from this perspective, that first there is a drop in a change in interest rates go down, then your equilibrium output rises. This is the relationship between the IS curve and saving investment. Any questions? No? Let's move on. Of course, all those things that we talked about that would affect saving and investment exist here as well. An increase in government purchases that causes planned expenditure to rise also causes equilibrium output to rise, thereby shifting the IS curve to the right. Conversely, a decline in government purchases would cause planned expenditure to fall at any given real interest rate and leads to a leftward shift in the IS curve, A rise in government purchases increases equilibrium output, and therefore it would cause a rightward shift in the IS curve, holding interest rates constant. So your interest rate would be the same, but because the intercept of the function changed, shifts to the right. This is why John Maynard Keynes was very happy with the Second World War. He wasn't like happy with the war, but he was actually saying that the war was a minor threat compared to the Great Depression. The Great Depression was like a monster that would never end, and people would starve and everything would end. It's just so scary. He was an economist. I mean, like, from my point of view, everything is economics. Why? Because I am studying economics. And they said, the Keynesians, they said that the war cut short the depression. Why? Because all those tanks, all those guns, all those ships, you need to pay for those. And by paying for those, you will stimulate the economy. You will increase output. Other things are remaining the same, your consumption, investment, everything the same. Just because of those tanks and those guns and those ships, you have increased outputs. Again, to that, the Austrians would answer, what's the point? Yes, we have more output, we have a bigger number, but what's the point of this bigger number? Are people more prosperous during the Second World War? No, that's not prosperity. War doesn't cause prosperity. This is a huge, like a complicated argument. I am not very familiar with this, but it's like an argument whether wars actually help the economy or not, or whether destruction in general is helpful or not. The Austrians say, no, Never. Even, yes, your output went up, but you just wasted everything. Just like built ships and sunk other people's ships and they sunk your ships. What's the point? Go ahead, Prem.
I was also gonna say that I think maybe when like I know Austrians tend to be kind of like they're less on output, more on like what is the inherent value behind some kind of good. Like that's why a lot of them are gold bugs, right? But I was gonna say like maybe another argument like behind maybe the war opposition is also because it causes rationing. When you're rationing goods and services in the economy, then people aren't able to make like proper transactions because there's a limited supply. Whereas like in a supposed prospering economy, you're supposed to have more of everything. Less.
People will always find a way to create a market. For example, in Soviet Union, everything was like rationed. It was a communist economy, so you had coupons for everything, and they invented a currency so that they can trade again in a new market. What would be their currency, do you think? Like I read it somewhere, it's very interesting. Very funny. Vodka, yes.
Yeah.
They used vodka as a form of currency. So people will always find a way to create a market. You know, like supply and demand, it would happen. But yeah, what you're saying is also correct. Like it was like highly distorting. The market was highly distorted by all those rations. So yeah. And of course,
Is the war argument basically just kind of like another way to say subsidies? Like, wouldn't the better argument for Keynesians be not war but subsidies? Because subsidies are basically kind of like basically no strings attached subsidies, where or like a grant actually, like a grant, where basically like we'll give you like the PPP loans. Basically, we'll give you this money. They put stipulations on it, but like if you're to basically just say, hey, we'll give you this money, this is government expenditure, and this will increase output. Whereas like the Austrians would say that, no, that's not really true, because like, at least supply siders would say, because like, maybe because you actually have to increase production, not just like trying to give money. So it's more about technology. I don't know. I mean, I think like, because it seems like Keynesians would also probably agree that rationing is bad. So they would prefer just to, like, hand money out directly, you know?
I mean, depends on the situation. Like if you're talking about World War II, because of the limited supply, rationing was the only way. Like
Yeah.
because of the limited supply. But for example, look at this Vietnam War buildup. In this, what you're saying actually happened in the 1960s, and instead of rationing, just government expenditure went up. There was no rationing. So United States involvement in the Vietnam War started in the 1960s, and it gradually became like worse and worse and worse. So the government had to spend more and more money on the war. All those ships and all those tanks and all those planes, they're not cheap. So the resulting increases in military expenditure erased the government expenditures. It then shifted the ice curve to the right side, which then overheated the economy. The economy in the 60s grew, but then something really bad happened after that, which kind of happened all over the world after it happened in the United States. And it was very high inflation rates. When real interest rate is constant, the increase in government purchases led to an overheating economy. This is what happened. 1964 to 1969, interest rate was kept constant. What happened was that increasing military spending shifted the IS curve rightward and therefore raising aggregate output. Very nice, right? But then later, 2 years later, 3 years later, inflation started. Inflation has costs. All those inflation costs made the economy go into recession during the President Carter's administration. And it actually took Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher to just do away with the whole system of Keynesian thinking, just get rid of it, bring back the neoclassicals to be able to get rid of that whole inflation and constant recession and all the problems associated with the 80s. So this 1970, good, later inflation, bad. So Austrians have a point here. Changes in taxes at the same time, as also like as a different scenario. At any given real interest rate, a rise in taxes causes planned expenditure and therefore equilibrium output to fall. If the government wants more of your money, well, you basically have to share with the government your earnings, so you'll have less with your for yourself. Let's assume I order a pizza, and then my roommate would want a slice, and my roommate is the United States government, so I can't reject him. He has like 3 or 4 armed forces, so I can't tell him no. So if my roommate wants a slice of my pizza, I have to pay it to him. And then I will not have a full pizza. I have less pizza. My consumption and therefore my output would fall, an increase in taxes. And this is why tax cuts are often very popular to stimulate the economy. The cut in taxes at any given real interest rate, it would increase your disposable income. So my roommate, the government, will want less of my money, would want a smaller portion of my money. And therefore, I will have more money to myself. And my expenditure, my consumption, everything will go up. Of course, this isn't saying that just lowering taxes all the time would help. Remember from your EC 202, if you lower taxes, this will happen. This is the good thing. But on the other hand, if the government doesn't cut its expenditures, what would happen? The government would have to borrow money. And if it borrows money, there will be less funds available to the public. And if it doesn't borrow money and it would lower its purchases, this curve, IS curve, would shift to the left. So you see, this is a trade-off. You need your taxes to run the government. If you lower taxes, people will have more money, but the government will have less expenditure. Therefore, this curve would shift left because of the reduction in government expenditure, and then it will shift right back up because of the tax cut. So you will not gain much if you consider all of them together. Which one is better? That's again a trade-off. This is the beauty of economics. You have constantly you face these trade-offs. Changes in taxes, lower taxes good, but also bad. Increase in government expenditure, it's good, but also bad. Everything in economics is like that. So yeah, covered this. Now, your real interest rates and your aggregate output. An increase in taxes would cause your disposable income to fall, therefore your equilibrium output to fall. Therefore, your causes a leftward shift in the IS curve to the left. This is an increase in taxes. Of course, this is if you assume that the government will just waste all the tax money. If the government actually spends tax money on government expenditure, then again shifts, the curve would just go back again to the right. So this is why these stuff gets so complicated. And on your exam, if I give you a question like this, I will put some assumption. It's usually something funny, like assume that the government, that the president would just buy himself a golden statue, builds a golden statue. That golden statue on your midterm was my assumption that this expenditure doesn't have any benefit for the economy. Or I may say that it will have a huge benefit for the economy. So be careful about that. Now, fiscal stimulus package of 2009. Now we're fiscal stimulus package of 2021. But this was the older fiscal stimulus package. By the time the Obama administration took office in January 2009, Great Recession has started. To stimulate the economy, Obama's administration proposed a fiscal stimulus package that included tax cuts, increased federal spending, and transfer payments. Excuse me. My throat is telling me that time is up almost. This stimulus package was intended to raise planned expenditure. They wanted to help people to spend more money to get the economy going up, thus shifting the IS curve to the right. The IS curve did not shift as right as hoped because the effects of the fiscal stimulus was more than offset by declines in consumption and investment. You see, the stimulus package was intended to raise planned expenditure and shift the IS curve to the right. But then the IS curve did not shift as much as everybody hoped, because the effects of the fiscal stimulus was more than offset by declines in consumption and investment. The severity of the 2008 Great Recession was underestimated. And also the stimulus package wasn't very efficient. I read a paper about this, about my own work. Like, now you don't need to worry about my work. About the whole COVID crisis. I was working on this program, and I read this paper, that this paper actually tested the effectiveness of government's packages in 2008 on every single part of the economy. The government, for example, paid huge sums of money towards education after 2008. Like huge stimulus packages went to the education department and schools. In reality, their returns was almost very, very low. Education sector on paper is very important. If you spend some money on it, everybody, like, you use your common sense and you'll be like, education is very important. If we spend money on education, it will give us a huge return. But in reality, it didn't happen in 2008. So a lot of money, large sums of money was spent on education and didn't came back. On the other hand, infrastructures, money that was spent on helping those states, especially like these tinier, like poorer states, that have to maintain a lot of roads and infrastructures for the federal government. Like, for example, if I don't know what, like a tiny, very poor state in the middle of the country, which has all the interstates connecting, let's say, Florida to California. That state received a lot of money from the government, spent it on maintaining those highways and those infrastructure. That return was super high. That was like money well spent. And here, the Austrian inside me needs to say this. This is why the Austrians are against this whole thing. They say, look, you see this whole packages being paid towards education and infrastructures and everything. Do you think they just came up with that themselves? Or do you think it's the result of lobbying? The reason you see not a really good return on those packages is that those packages have already been lobbied heavily. Everybody wants money for his buddies or her friends, or like my lobby. If I am like a senator from, I don't know, like senator from any state, I would lobby to get more funding for my own estate. That's the issue with the government. All these, like actually in my own research, I saw something that was very interesting. I wanted to tell you about this. The seniority of a congressman or a congresswoman would actually mean more stimulus for the state. So if you're, for example, if your congressman or if your congresswoman is very old, even though if you don't like his or her politics, you may keep voting for him or her. Why? Because data has proved that the older they are, the more senior they are, the more experienced they are in politics, the more years they spent in the halls of Congress or the Senate, the more money they're going to bring back. So the whole idea of fiscal stimulus, it sounds good on paper, but in reality, it's a constant. It's like watching a WWE game. It's just like, here comes the Undertaker. He's throwing the rock across the fence, like all of that. It's just a constant war. It's not like something about efficiency. It's all political. So this is what the Austrians say. Okay, think it's enough for today. My voice is almost disappearing, so let's finish today. And on Monday, there is no class. There will be your midterm exam, and I will upload your questions. It will be like the first midterm. You'll have 24 hours to take the exam. The exam will be open book. Some questions will be very easy. Some questions will not be very easy. So please read the questions carefully. You'll have access to your notebook and everything. And good luck. And I will also, I promise you, if I can like make my boss go away for a few hours, I will finish your homeworks and your midterm exam. I will let you know about it. No attendance.